Open this gate right now, or I'm calling the police. You think you can just lock out the entire neighborhood like some kind of... Victoria Westbrook's voice cracked through my Saturday morning like breaking glass, her hot pink blazer practically vibrating with rage as she hammered on my intercom button. I stood in my driveway, coffee still warm in my hand, watching three faces pressed against the iron bars of my fence like prisoners demanding freedom they'd never been denied. Her perfectly manicured finger French tips probably cost more than my monthly electric bill turned white from the pressure she was applying to that button. My daughter Riley appeared at the upstairs window, phone already recording. Smart kid. I walked to the gate, each step deliberate, knowing what came next would turn my 3 acres in Riverside County, California, into a battlefield that would end in a courtroom. Ever had someone demand access to something that was never theirs to take? This is what happens when you say no. The gate stayed closed. I'd installed it myself 7 years ago when I bought this land, back when the nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road and silence was the only thing that greeted me each morning. 3 acres of unincorporated county landmine, free and clear, purchased in 2018 with money I'd saved from 2 decades, running my auto body shop in San Bernardino. The deeds sat in my filing cabinet, every page, legal and binding, showing exactly what I owned and what nobody else had any right to touch. I'd checked 4 times with the county recorder before signing anything, made sure the zoning was correct, verified the property lines down to the inch. This wasn't impulse. This was the foundation I'd promised my wife Carmen we'd build together before the stroke took her 3 years ago. Victoria's face had gone from red to purple, that hot pink blazer seeming to glow brighter with her fury. She turned to the 2 people flanking her, a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit on a Saturday morning, and a younger woman clutching an iPad like it was a shield against reality. They nodded at whatever she whispered, and I watched the whole performance through the camera monitor I'd mounted just inside my workshop door. 8 cameras covered every angle of my property. 4 on the fence, 2 at the gate, 2 guarding the shop where I restored classic cars and motorcycles. I'd wired the system myself, each cable sealed and buried deep, feeding a recorder with 60 days of backup storage. The faint red LEDs blinked like sentries, enough to remind Victoria she was being seen, being recorded, being documented. She pressed the intercom again, and I heard Riley's footsteps on the stairs behind me as she came down to see what the commotion was about. My daughter was 17, old enough to understand that sometimes people pushed, and you had to decide whether to push back or step aside. I'd been stepping aside for 8 months now, ignoring the letters, deleting the emails, staying quiet while they tried to pretend I didn't exist, or that I'd somehow volunteered to join their little kingdom. But this was different. This was them coming to my gate, onto my land, demanding entry like they owned the place. The property stretched out behind me, 3 acres of carefully maintained independence that drove the HOA absolutely insane. I hadn't planted uniform grass or trimmed hedges into geometric shapes. Instead, there was native California scrub that required no watering, a vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes and peppers than Riley and I could eat, and oak trees that had been here longer than any of us. The workshop sat 50 feet from the main house, a 1,200 square foot building with corrugated metal siding I'd installed myself, solar panels on the roof, providing enough power to run my welding equipment and air compressors without touching the grid. Inside was the '67 Mustang I was restoring for a client in Los Angeles, the Harley-Davidson Panhead that had been my father's before he passed, and walls lined with tools organized by size and function. In the corner stood the filing cabinet that proved every square inch was mine. Deeds, permits, survey maps, every document signed, stamped, verified. Each letter I'd sent declining the HOA's overreach sat there too, a record of patience rather than defiance. I'd known from the moment the developer started building houses around my land that eventually someone would get ideas. What I hadn't expected was how organized they'd become, how systematic their harassment would feel, or how much Victoria Westbrook would make this her personal crusade. She'd moved here 18 months ago, one of the first to buy into the new development they called Sagebrush Meadows. 43 houses, all identical except for the 4 paint colors, the HOA pre-approved, all subject to covenants, conditions, and restrictions that ran 32 pages deep and controlled everything from mailbox styles to how many inches you could let your grass grow before they fined you. The HOA formed in early 2023, right after the last house sold, and Victoria got herself elected president within 2 months. At first, she'd been polite, sent me a welcome letter, invited me to meetings, suggested I might want to consider joining voluntarily to maintain good relations with my new neighbors. I'd written back thanking her for the invitation and explaining that my property predated the HOA, wasn't subject to their CC&Rs, and that I preferred to remain independent. She'd accepted that for about 4 months. Then Cameron Blackwell joined the board. I didn't know much about him, except that he wore $1,000 suits, drove a Tesla that cost more than most people's annual salary, and had a way of looking at my property like he was already measuring it for something else. After he showed up, the tone of the letters changed. Courtesy reminders became violation notices. Suggestions became demands. They claimed my workshop wasn't approved, even though I had county permits framed on the wall. They said my landscaping didn't meet community standards, even though I wasn't part of their community. They insisted my fence was too tall, even though county code allowed up to 8 feet, and mine was only 6. Every letter got more aggressive, every demand more absurd, and every time I responded with documentation proving they had no authority over my property. Riley appeared at my elbow, and I could see her phone screen still recording. She'd learned that from me the importance of documentation, of having proof when someone tried to rewrite history later. She was wearing one of my old work shirts, sleeves rolled up, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and I felt a sharp pang remembering Carmen at that age. The same fierce intelligence in her eyes, the same refusal to back down when something was wrong. We'd lost Carmen 3 years ago, and for a while after that, I'd barely functioned. The workshop had saved me, giving me something to do with my hands when my mind couldn't process the grief. Riley had been 14 then, and she'd spent hours sitting on a stool watching me sand and weld and paint, not saying much. Just being present while we both figured out how to exist in a world that didn't include her mother. Through the camera monitor, I watched Victoria pull out her phone. She was calling someone, gesturing angrily at my gate, and I wondered who she thought would care that I wouldn't let her onto my private property. The county sheriff wouldn't force me to open my gate without a warrant. The HOA had no enforcement power over non-members. This was theater, a performance for whoever she was trying to impress, and I was tired of being the audience. The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't Victoria's voice. It was the man in the suit, Cameron Blackwell, and his tone was different, smoother, more calculated, like he was used to getting what he wanted through persuasion rather than volume. His words were reasonable on the surface, talking about community cooperation and property values and being good neighbors. But underneath was something else, a threat that wasn't quite spoken, an implication that things could get difficult if I didn't play along, a suggestion that maybe I should reconsider my position before this escalated further. I looked at Riley, saw her jaw tighten the same way Carmen's used to when someone underestimated her, and I made a decision. Not to fight, not yet, but to make absolutely clear that this property was mine, that these people had no authority here, and that every step they took from this point forward would be documented, recorded, and stored safely away for the day when documentation became evidence. I picked up the intercom handset and spoke clearly, knowing the cameras were capturing audio as well as video. This is private property. You're trespassing by refusing to leave after being asked. I have no obligation to open my gate or discuss anything with you. If you have official business, put it in writing and send it certified mail. Then I set the handset down and walked back toward the workshop, Riley following silently behind me. Through the monitor mounted on the workshop wall, I watched Victoria slam her clipboard against the gate bars hard enough that the clang echoed across the property. The sound made Riley flinch. 3 minutes later, they finally left. Victoria's Mercedes kicking up dust as she accelerated too fast down the gravel road. Riley sat on my workbench, legs swinging, but she wasn't looking at me. Her fingers picked at a paint chip on the wood edge, that nervous habit she'd had since she was 10. "Dad, is this going to be a problem?" I told her the truth. It already is a problem. But problems have solutions. The first step is understanding exactly what we're dealing with. I pulled out the filing cabinet drawer and showed her everything. I'd kept every letter, every response, every piece of documentation. She started reading, and I went back to buffing out a scratch on the Mustang's quarter panel that I'd been working on before Victoria's theatrical entrance. That night, after Riley went to bed, I sat in my office staring at my laptop screen. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but I couldn't stop scrolling through page after page of county records. The anger I'd kept controlled all day sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and sharp-edged. I researched Cameron Blackwell and found his real estate development consulting firm. His LinkedIn profile showing connections to developers throughout Southern California, his involvement with multiple HOA boards over the past 7 years. Then I searched recent planning commission meetings and found something that made that stone in my chest turn to ice. A proposal for a mixed-use development called Sagebrush Commons, directly adjacent to Sagebrush Meadows, filed by a company called Riverside Properties LLC. The proposal was contingent on access easement resolution for certain parcels, and when I pulled up the parcel numbers, one of them was mine. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. This was about someone wanting my land and being willing to use the HOA as a weapon to get it. I sat back in my chair, the house silent around me except for the hum of the computer fan, and understood that everything was about to get worse before it got better. But at least now I knew what I was fighting. 2 weeks later, the certified letter arrived. 6 pages claiming I violated their CC&R's workshop, not approved, landscaping below standards, fence too tall, $500 per day fines, 14 days to comply, or they'd place a lien on my property. Victoria's signature in purple ink, Cameron's countersignature, that hot pink blazer, practically part of the letterhead. I spread proof across my kitchen table deed, permits, title report, zoning letter, photographed everything, backed it up to the cloud, drafted a 3-page response with facts and code citations. Mailed it certified, copied the county attorney, logged every step. Riley came home and saw the paperwork. "Can they really put a lien on our house?" "No, they have no authority. But that doesn't mean they won't try, or that this will be easy. What do we do?" "Document everything. Respond in writing. Make sure we have proof." The response came faster than I expected, not from Victoria or the HOA board, but from the neighborhood itself. Someone, probably Victoria, had posted on the community Facebook group that a resident was refusing to comply with HOA standards and threatening property values for everyone in Sagebrush Meadows. The post didn't name me directly, but it described my property in enough detail that anyone who'd driven past would know exactly who it meant. Within 24 hours, Victoria's Facebook post had 87 comments. Most were attacks, people calling me selfish, above the rules, threatening property values, but some defended me. Miguel Santos, whose Chevy I'd restored for free, said I'd been kind and helpful. Sarah Chen pointed out my property wasn't part of the HOA. Marcus Williams said this felt wrong. Riley scrolled through with her jaw tight. Why are people saying these things when they don't even know us? Fear made people cruel. And it spread to school, parents talking, kids picking up the thread, comments about how her dad thought he was special, questions about what we were hiding. She came home one afternoon, went straight to her room. 20 minutes later, I found her crying. Why can't we just do what they want? Fix everything, make this stop? I sat on her bed. Giving in to bullies doesn't make them stop. It teaches them bullying works. This house, this land, it's the last thing your mother and I built together. Every tool in the workshop was chosen by Carmen, the oak tree's shade where we scattered her ashes. This isn't stubbornness, it's protecting something that matters. Are you scared? Yes, but being scared and being right aren't mutually exclusive. That night, I took screenshots of every comment on Facebook, saved them with timestamps and usernames, and added them to a new folder labeled Harassment Evidence. I also started a spreadsheet tracking every incident, every letter, every confrontation, organizing them by date and type and parties involved. Riley helped her natural facility with computers, making the process faster. We worked side by side in my office, and by midnight we had a comprehensive timeline of everything that had happened since Victoria first sent that welcome letter 18 months ago. The weekend brought another confrontation. Saturday morning, I was in the workshop replacing the carburetor on the Mustang when I heard voices at the gate again. This time there were 6 people. Victoria in front, wearing that hot pink blazer like a uniform, looking like she'd dressed for a formal meeting. Cameron Blackwell beside her, hands in his pockets, that calculating expression on his face. The woman with the iPad, whose name I'd learned was Ashley Morrison, stood slightly behind them, and 3 neighbors I recognized from Facebook: Derek Patterson, Jennifer Martinez, and someone I didn't know. Through the intercom, Victoria announced they were representing the concerns of 43 homeowners whose property values I was destroying through my refusal to maintain community standards. She had a petition, she said, signed by 28 households demanding I bring my property into compliance or face legal action. Cameron stepped closer to the camera. When he spoke, his voice had that smooth quality that made reasonable words sound like threats. "Marcus, we can talk like adults here. Find a solution that works for everyone. The HOA is prepared to make a generous buyout offer if you're interested in relocating somewhere that better suits your lifestyle preferences." I asked what the offer was, more curious than interested. Cameron smiled at the camera. $350,000 above assessed value, plus $75,000 for moving expenses. Over $500,000 just to walk away, find somewhere else. Stop being a problem. I looked at Riley, who'd come out when she heard the voices. She was 17 years old, standing in the yard where her mother had planted native wildflowers, looking at 6 adults who wanted to buy her home out from under her because it was easier than respecting boundaries. I looked back at the camera. "The property's not for sale at any price." Cameron's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. He mentioned Riley by name, said I should think about her future, about college expenses and opportunities, about whether I wanted to make her life harder by being stubborn about principle. That's when I understood this had crossed a line. Victoria making demands was one thing. Cameron bringing my daughter into his pitch was something else entirely. "All of you need to leave my property immediately. Don't come back without a warrant or a court order." I ended the intercom call and watched through the monitor as they stood there for another 4 minutes. Victoria's face red with fury, Cameron looking at my house like he was appraising it for demolition, that hot pink blazer practically glowing with her rage. When they finally left, I pulled out my phone and searched for property rights attorneys in Riverside County. Found a woman named Diana Reeves whose website specialized in HOA disputes and property rights cases. I called her office and left a message explaining the situation, asking for a consultation as soon as possible. Then, I saved the video footage from the gate cameras, tagged it with date and time, and added it to the evidence folder that was growing larger every day. The local news van pulled up 2 weeks later on a Wednesday afternoon. I was welding a patch panel on the Mustang when Riley came running to tell me there was a reporter asking to speak with me. Through the window, I could see a woman with a microphone standing near my fence, a cameraman beside her filming B-roll of my property from the public road. The woman waved when she saw me looking. "Mr. Delgado, I've spoken with the HOA president about the dispute and wanted to give you a chance to share your side of the story. I considered sending her away like I'd done with Victoria's entourage. But if the HOA was taking this to the media, the narrative was already being written, and silence meant letting someone else control the story." I walked to the gate. "I'll talk to you, but only if you agree to show the documentation I have proving my case." She agreed immediately. I let her and the cameraman onto my property for the first time since I'd installed the gate 7 years ago. We set up in the workshop, and she asked me to explain the situation from the beginning. I showed her the deed, dated 2018, the title report with no HOA restrictions, the building permits signed by the county inspector. I was calm, factual, letting the paperwork speak louder than emotion could. The reporter took notes and filmed everything I showed her. She asked about the HOA's claims, and I walked her through each alleged violation, explaining why none of them applied to property that predated the organization trying to enforce them. When we finished, she told me the segment would air in 3 days. I thanked her and watched her van drive away, hoping I hadn't just made a terrible mistake. The segment aired Friday evening. Riley and I watched together, and I had to admit the reporter had done a fair job. Victoria got her sound bites about community standards and property values, looking composed and reasonable in her hot pink blazer. But then came my section showing the deed on camera, the permits, the title report, my calm explanation that I respected the HOA's right to exist, but asked them to respect my property rights in return. Comments on the station's website started rolling in within minutes. 65% supported my position, calling out HOA overreach and sharing their own horror stories. Property rights activists shared the segment, and suddenly my quiet 3 acres were being discussed by people across Southern California. But the media attention also brought something else: scrutiny, questions, and apparently it made someone nervous enough to escalate beyond words and letters. Tuesday morning at 1:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion sensor alert. I jerked awake, grabbing the phone from my nightstand, and saw on the screen that 2 figures were at my workshop, bolt cutters in hand, working on the padlock. My heart slammed against my ribs. I rolled out of bed, pulled on jeans and a shirt, and moved down the hall to Riley's room. I shook her awake gently. "Lock your door and call 911. Someone's breaking into the workshop. I'm not going to confront them, but I need you safe while we wait for the sheriff." Riley's face went pale in the darkness, but she nodded and reached for her phone. I went to my office and pulled up the full camera array on my monitors. 2 men worked on my workshop door with efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first break-in. One was tall and heavy, the other shorter and wiry, both wearing dark hoodies and gloves. I called 911 myself, speaking quietly, giving the dispatcher my address and describing what I was seeing. She told me deputies were 12 minutes out, that I should stay in the house, that under no circumstances should I approach the intruders. The shorter man got the padlock off, and both disappeared into my workshop. Through the interior camera I'd mounted near the ceiling, I watched them spread out, flashlights sweeping across tools and the Mustang and filing cabinets. They weren't there to steal equipment. They went straight for the filing cabinet, yanking open drawers, pulling out folders, clearly looking for something specific. One of them said something I couldn't make out on the audio, and the other replied with words that made my blood freeze. Someone said the permits would be here. Just need to check if they're real or faked. That meant someone had sent them, given them instructions, pointed them at my property like a weapon aimed at my legitimacy. 11 minutes after my call, I heard sirens. The men heard them too, and suddenly they were running, dropping folders, scrambling for the door. But the deputies were fast, blocking the driveway with their vehicles, lights flashing red and blue. The men tried to run toward the back fence, but there was nowhere to go with cameras tracking every move and deputies cutting them off. Within 3 minutes, both intruders were on the ground in handcuffs, and a deputy was knocking on my front door asking if everyone inside was safe. One of the intruders was Derek Patterson, the neighbor who'd posted about HOA compliance on Facebook, who'd stood at my gate 2 weeks ago with Victoria's group. The other was someone I didn't recognize, later identified as a handyman Derek had hired for various jobs around the neighborhood. The deputy questioning Derek came back inside an hour later with information that made everything clearer and worse. Derek claimed he just wanted to verify that my permits were real, that Victoria had suggested if they could prove I'd faked the documents, the HOA would have grounds to force compliance. Derek and his accomplice were arrested for breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and criminal trespass. The deputies took my camera footage as evidence, gave me a case number, and told me I could pick up copies of their reports within 3 business days. As the sun started lightening the eastern sky, Riley and I sat on the front porch, neither of us capable of going back to sleep. Do you think Victoria really told Derek to do this? I don't know, but whether she explicitly ordered it or just created an environment where someone thought it was acceptable doesn't matter much. The damage is done. The HOA held an emergency meeting that evening. I didn't attend, but Sarah Chen went and reported back. Victoria claimed she'd never told Derek to break into my property, that this was his individual action driven by concern for the neighborhood. Cameron Blackwell sat silent through the entire meeting, offering no comment, no defense, no explanation. The board voted to suspend Derek, but took no other action against their own leadership. I spent the next 2 days organizing evidence, 6 camera angles of the break-in, the 911 call recording, the deputy's report listing what the intruders had said during questioning, Derek's statement about Victoria suggesting they verify my documents. All of it went into a new binder labeled Criminal Activity Evidence. Then I called Diana Reeves, the attorney whose card I'd been carrying. This time she picked up on the second ring. We need to talk about going on offense, because defense isn't going to be enough anymore. Her office was in downtown Riverside, converted Victorian house with law books lining every wall. She listened to my story for an hour, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally stopping me for clarification or specific dates. When I finished, she sat back. You have 3 options. First, settle and take whatever buyout they're offering. Second, defend when they sue and prove they have no jurisdiction. Third, counterattack by suing them for harassment and conspiracy. The third option was the most expensive, potentially $60,000 if it went to trial, but it was also the only one that might expose what was really happening and stop them from doing this to someone else. I didn't hesitate. Option 3. She outlined a strategy built on establishing my property rights with ironclad documentation, proving the harassment pattern through my timeline, and hardest of all, proving the conspiracy between the HOA board and the developer who wanted my land. She'd hire a private investigator to follow the money, trace financial connections, find the links I suspected but couldn't prove. The investigator was expensive, $250 an hour, but he was ex-FBI and specialized in corporate manipulation cases. I wrote the retainer check for $15,000. The investigator called 5 days later. He'd pulled financial records, corporate filings, public documents. What he'd found was damning enough that I asked for everything in writing. The report arrived by courier that afternoon, 63 pages showing exactly how money flowed. $175,000 from Riverside Properties, LLC to Cameron Blackwell's consulting firm 6 months before he joined the board. $90,000 from Cameron's firm to the HOA as community development donations, all spent on legal actions against me. $3,000 to Derek Patterson 4 days before the break-in, traced through a shell company Cameron owned. The investigator had also found a pattern 4 other properties in 6 years where this developer had used identical tactics. Infiltrating HOA boards, pressuring holdout owners, acquiring land below market after the owners broke. 3 settled quickly with non-disclosure agreements. 1 abandoned their property after 20 months of harassment. I was the first who'd fought back with legal representation before the pressure broke me, which meant I was the first chance to expose the whole operation. I showed the report to Riley that evening. She read it slowly at the kitchen table. When she finished, her eyes were harder than I'd ever seen them. It's not fair that people can weaponize systems to take what they want. I agreed, but fair and legal weren't the same thing. And our job was to document everything so thoroughly that nobody could claim later they hadn't known. Diana called 3 days later with a proposal. She wanted to organize a community meeting, invite all the neighbors, present the evidence of what the developer was doing. It was risky, it would force the board to respond and might accelerate whatever they had planned next, but it would shift the narrative from me being a stubborn holdout to someone protecting the community from exploitation. She'd rented the community center for Thursday evening. I gave my permission, feeling like I'd committed to something that couldn't be undone. Thursday came fast. Riley helped me load presentation materials into my truck, printed copies of the financial flowcharts, development plans, timeline. We arrived 30 minutes early and set up a projector. 32 households showed up out of 43, a shocking turnout. Victoria sat in the front row looking defensive, that hot pink blazer like armor. Cameron beside her with that calculating expression. The reporter who'd done the earlier segments stood in the back with a camera. I stood at the front and started with simple truth. I'm not your enemy. I've been here before the HOA existed. I've helped neighbors. I've tried to live quietly. But the past year has been a coordinated campaign to harass me into selling. I showed the development plans, explained how my 3 acres connected the neighborhood to the proposed commercial complex, how without my property the developer would lose millions. Then I showed the money trail payments to Cameron, donations to the HOA, the shell company payment to Derek, the timeline showing calls preceding every escalation. The room went silent. People turned to look at Victoria and Cameron. Victoria's face cycled through shock and confusion and betrayal. Cameron, is this true? Did you take money from a developer? Did you manipulate the board? Cameron stood without answering and walked toward the exit. He left the building while everyone watched. That silence, that refusal to defend himself, was louder than any confession. After he was gone, people started asking questions, voices overlapping. Diana stepped forward to explain what legal options the community had for removing board members, demanding transparency, protecting themselves from being used again. The developer showed up at my gate 3 days after the community meeting. Monroe Whitlock, I knew his name before he introduced himself, had researched his company, understood exactly who he was and why he'd come. I watched him through the camera monitor as he parked his Tesla, stepped out wearing a casual suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and walked to the intercom like he owned the place already. He was in his early 50s, tanned and fit, with the confidence that came from years of getting what he wanted. When he pressed the button, his voice was smooth, reasonable. Mr. Delgado, I think we should talk man to man. Cut through all the noise and figure out how to end this in a way that benefits both of us. I told him through the intercom that I was recording the conversation, that everything he said would be documented and potentially used in court. He smiled at the camera. I'd expect nothing less. I opened the gate and watched him walk up my driveway with casual ease. We sat in my living room. He didn't waste time with small talk. Marcus, I respect what you've done. Fighting back, exposing the financial connection, standing up for principle, but you're fighting a battle you can't win. Not because you're wrong, but because I have resources and time and patience that you don't. I can keep this going for years, appeal every ruling, file new motions, drag the legal process out until your attorney bills bankrupt you or exhaustion makes you give up. Then he made his offer. $900,000 for your 3 acres, 200% of market value, plus $100,000 for moving expenses, over $1 million total. Riley's entire college fund. Her future security you couldn't provide by being stubborn about principle. I asked what would happen if I refused. He shrugged. The litigation continues. I'll win some motions, lose some, but ultimately I have deeper pockets. And Marcus? He leaned forward slightly. Think about what Carmen would have wanted. Whether she'd want you sacrificing Riley's well-being for a piece of land that's just dirt and trees. When you strip away the sentiment, that's when he crossed the line that made my decision simple and permanent. I stood up. Never mention my wife again. You don't know anything about what she would have wanted. The answer is no. Not because I'm stubborn, but because if I take your money, I teach my daughter that bullies win when you're scared enough. And that's a lesson I refuse to give her. He stood slowly. Something changed in his expression. The friendliness didn't disappear, but underneath I could see calculation, reassessment now that reason hadn't worked. You had your chance. Whatever happens from this point forward is on you for choosing the hard way when an easy path was offered. Then he walked out. I immediately saved the recording and texted Diana. She responded within minutes. This is perfect. It proves Whitlock knew about the harassment and was directly connected. 2 days later, the escalation arrived in a form I hadn't anticipated. The school principal called Monday morning asking me to come in for an urgent meeting about Riley. When I arrived, confused and worried, she showed me an anonymous email her office had received, claiming I was operating an illegal business from my residential property, that my workshop contained hazardous materials without proper permits, and that my daughter was being exposed to dangerous equipment in violation of child safety laws. The email suggested Child Protective Services should investigate potential child endangerment. The principal was apologetic. She didn't believe any of it, but district policy required her to report the complaint. A CPS investigator would be contacting me within 48 hours. I drove home feeling rage I hadn't experienced since Carmen's diagnosis. They'd gone after my daughter directly, filing a false report designed to terrify a 17-year-old girl into thinking she might be taken from her father. When I told Riley, I watched her face go pale. Tears well up as she asked if they could actually take her away. I pulled her into a hug. They can't, because none of it's true. I spent the next 48 hours preparing for the CPS visit with meticulous attention. I gathered every workshop permit, every safety certification, every piece of documentation showing my business was legal and compliant. I photographed the safety equipment, the locked cabinets where I kept welding gases, the clear separation between professional tools and anything Riley was allowed near. I got written statements from neighbors confirming I was careful about safety. I documented the timeline showing Whitlock's visit, my refusal, and this CPS complaint arriving 2 days later. The investigator was thorough and professional. After 2 hours, she told me what I needed to hear officially. The complaint is completely unfounded. Your workshop is one of the safest home business setups I've inspected. Riley is clearly well cared for and in no danger. I'm closing the case immediately with a finding of no merit. I filed a police report that afternoon. The detective assigned a case number that went into my evidence file. I also called the reporter. She came out that evening to interview both me and Riley. My daughter spoke on camera about being scared that someone would take her away, about how the false report felt like an attack designed to hurt her because hurting me hadn't worked. The segment aired 2 days later. Public response was immediate and angry. Comments flooded in, calling the tactics disgusting, demanding accountability. The community meeting after the CPS story broke turned into a full revolt. 40 households showed up demanding answers. Victoria tried to defend herself, producing emails showing Cameron had assured her the donations were normal and legal, claiming she'd never known about the developer payments. She cried genuine tears. But Cameron didn't show up. Instead, his attorney submitted a resignation letter, vague language about business conflicts, no apology. The vote was overwhelming. Victoria was removed as president 36-4. The new interim board voted to cease all legal action against me, to return Cameron's donations, and to commission an independent audit. They issued a public apology acknowledging the organization had been misled and used as a weapon. I spoke briefly at the end. I don't want to destroy the HOA. I understand why people want community standards. I just want it to serve actual members instead of outside interests. But I'm continuing my lawsuit against Whitlock and Cameron because this isn't about settling scores with neighbors who were manipulated. This is about making sure they face consequences that prevent them from doing it again. Diana filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office 3 days later. The assistant DA assigned to review it specialized in public integrity cases. When she called us in for an initial meeting 2 weeks later, I could tell from her expression she'd found what we'd found, a pattern too obvious to ignore. She laid out potential counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, filing false government reports, witness tampering based on the payment to Derek. If phone records and emails were authenticated, she'd recommend prosecution. The forensic verification took 3 weeks. Every call between Whitlock and Cameron matched my timeline. Email metadata showed messages originated from their actual servers. Bank records verified every wire transfer. Meanwhile, witnesses came forward. Derek agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. The HOA secretary provided emails showing Cameron had dictated meeting agendas. Victoria gave a statement confirming Cameron had fed her information while never mentioning his financial connection. Most powerful was a man the investigator located who'd lost his property to Whitlock 2 years earlier using tactics nearly identical to mine. He'd sold for $200,000 below fair value because he couldn't handle the stress. Whitlock Development LLC purchased it within a week. The civil lawsuit moved forward. The HOA settled before trial, paying $75,000 in damages and implementing policy changes. That left Whitlock and Cameron as defendants. Their defense strategy was predictable: claim everything was normal, business dealings. That phone calls proved nothing. They filed motion after motion to delay and drain my resources. But Diana was better. She opposed every motion with documentation. The judge denied most of them. 6 weeks after we filed, we had a trial date. The night before jury selection, the community organized a rally outside the courthouse. More than 200 people showed up, neighbors mixed with property rights activists and people who'd followed the story through news coverage. When Riley took the microphone, my chest tightened with pride and fear. She spoke clearly despite nervousness, telling everyone about being 17 and watching strangers break into her home, about the terror of thinking CPS might take her away, about learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but taking action despite being scared. My dad taught me that standing up for what's right is hard and lonely and sometimes costly, but it's necessary because letting bullies win means teaching the next generation that power matters more than justice. People applauded, and some cried. The trial started the next morning. The courtroom packed, Victoria in her hot pink blazer looking defensive, Cameron fidgeting. Diana's opening was masterful, showing timelines, money trails, phone calls preceding every escalation. The county clerk authenticated my deed. Riley testified about the terror of thinking CPS would take her away. 3 jurors wiped their eyes. Derek confirmed Cameron paid him $3,000 and provided bolt cutters. The forensic accountant traced money from Whitlock to Cameron to the HOA to Derek with flowcharts. Whitlock took the stand. Diana's cross-examination was surgical, walking him through emails where he'd written, "I needed to learn everyone's cells eventually," instructing Cameron to increase pressure. The turning point. She asked about 47 phone calls with Cameron. When he fumbled explaining why 90% lasted under 5 minutes, she showed a call 2 days before the break-in. "I didn't tell Derek to break in," Whitlock said, using Derek's name without being asked. "How did you know I was referring to the break-in if you hadn't been briefed on when it happened?" His face went pale. Cameron refused to testify, invoking the Fifth. In civil court, the jury could consider that refusal as evidence. After 7 hours of deliberation, the verdict: liable on all counts. $320,000 compensatory, $280,000 emotional distress, $1.2 million punitive against Whitlock, $600,000 against Cameron, total $2,400,000. Riley hugged me while the gallery applauded. Whitlock sat frozen. Cameron had his head in his hands. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. I kept my statement simple. This was about justice for everyone. Whitlock had victimized, and everyone who might have been next. Property rights matter, truth matters, standing up to bullies matters. And sometimes, if you document everything and find good people to help you fight, truth actually wins. Whitlock appealed. 7 months later, the appellate court affirmed all findings, reduced punitive damages slightly. Final judgment, $2,100,000. Criminal trials followed. 18 months prison, license revoked 10 years. 2 years prison, permanent revocation. The community transformed. New board implemented transparency bylaws, prohibited outside influence, protected non-HOA properties. I advised on property law, taught monthly workshops. Diana ran legal clinics. Riley got into UCLA pre-law, wanting to help people facing institutional bullying. I used settlement money for a scholarship fund in Carmen's name, expanded my business, donated to legal aid. The state passed the Delgado Law HOA Accountability Act, establishing that HOAs couldn't claim pre-formation properties, requiring transparency, criminalizing bribes, making attorney fees recoverable. I testified at hearings. The bill passed with bipartisan support. 2 years later, 80 people gathered on my property for a community barbecue. Kids played in the wildflower meadow. Adults toured the workshop. The vegetable garden produced tomatoes. People harvested in paper bags. Diana came with her family. The investigator stopped by. The reporter filmed a follow-up. I stood at my workbench with Riley, watching neighbors talk and laugh. Do you think we made the right choice? Fighting instead of selling? I'd thought about that often, especially during the worst moments. Looking at the community we built, the legal changes protecting others, the consequences bullies faced, we made the only choice we could live with. When I become an attorney, I'll remember justice isn't just courtrooms. It's everyday choices to stand up when it's hard. That's exactly what your mother would have wanted you to learn. The sun set over the property we defended. The house stood solid on foundations built from principle and evidence and refusing to let fear dictate choices. This wasn't just land and tools and memories. It was proof that ordinary people could win when they documented everything, found good allies, and refused to surrender what was rightfully theirs. Riley leaned against me in silence. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like waiting for the next fight. It felt like peace.